Hey everybody, we're continuing our series on our Anglican heritage. And you'll recall that we're in the middle of our second sub-series, the Middle Ages. So last week we looked at the issue of church and crown. And next week we'll look at late medieval mysticism. For today though, our emphasis will be on the age of Wycliffe, looking in particular at the very interesting, very colorful figure of John Wycliffe. Putting him in context, the 14th century, that is the 1300s, was an enormously difficult time for England and her church, and really all of Western Europe. This was a very, very difficult century, in large part because of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that in many parts of Western Europe killed as much as 50%, an entire half of the population. That is a pandemic with a capital P. And the social and economic consequences of the Black Death were in fact enormous. This devastated the population of England, and it led to great unrest. Suddenly, peasant labor is in great demand, and so they're expecting higher wages. And when their demands for higher wages or the ability to leave serfdom, when those demands are not met, there in fact is a peasant uprising in England, the Great Revolt of 1381, which was in fact supported by many of the clergy who were also discontented by the state of affairs in England after the Black Death. The Black Death actually hit clergy in England particularly hard. And you can imagine clergy being called out to minister to the sick and the dying are almost certainly going to be exposed to the Black Death. And so this hits the church in England especially bad. Another important aspect of the 14th century concerning religion is that the power and prestige of the Pope is greatly declining. It's during this time that the Pope moves his court from Rome to Avignon in France. France at this time was England's great enemy, and so the Pope has moved in with England's greatest enemies. Well, that's a problem if you're England. And in response, Parliament is going to pass laws to diminish the Pope's power over England. So this is the context in which then we can understand the life and work of John Wycliffe. So Wycliffe is primarily known for the movement that he began to reform church doctrine. Now, we've seen through the Middle Ages any number of people who were interested in reforming practices of the church. But here we have a unique figure in that it's very rare to have someone saying that the church's theology itself is wrong and needs to change. So that's what makes Wycliffe quite distinct from a number of his predecessors. He actually wants to change doctrine. Now, technically, he was a parish priest, but he was never there, really. He hired someone else to take care of the affairs of the parish. Most of his adult life, he's settled at Oxford University, where he's a scholar, churning out these controversial pamphlets that will make him famous and also get him in quite a bit of trouble. So initially, he's attacking the church's corruption, and you can get a feel for his tone with some quotes of how he criticizes the church at the time. For instance, he calls the Pope a poisonous weed, the head vicar of the fiend, and a simple idiot who might be a damned devil in hell. Not a nice way to talk about the Pope. You can imagine that will get him in trouble. Likewise, he argues that the monks of his day had lost their focus on asceticism, on discipline of the body, and now we're pursuing what he called the religion of fat cows. He also goes after the friars, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, calling them apostates and degenerates. So it sounds a lot like Martin Luther later on with his invective. And you can tell that he's going to get himself into quite a bit of trouble. The central idea that Wycliffe becomes known for, that sparks his call for reform of the church doctrine, is his idea that all legitimate dominion, meaning all lordship or power, comes from God and is characterized by the example of Christ, who came to serve and not be served. So on the one hand, through the Middle Ages, kings and popes alike had claimed that their dominion, their power, their authority, came from God to them, which then they could exercise over others. In other words, the kings and the popes were God's chosen intermediaries who had absolute dominion over the people below them. Wycliffe, though, claims that no, that's not right, that in fact all dominion is derived directly from God. So in other words, cutting out the middleman of pope and king, and that any true lordship used for the profit of, any lordship used for the profit of the ruler rather than the governed is thereby unjust. So the Pope, for instance, collecting Peter's pence from the people of England, serving him, but not in any way benefiting the people of England, that would be an example of unjust lordship. And initially, the crown in England is very supportive of Wycliffe as saying. He's attacking the Pope. That's great from their perspective. But pretty soon he can turn this argument against the English crown itself, because he'll say any dominion that seeks to expand its power beyond the limits of its authority is unjust. Wycliffe looks in vain in the Bible, in the New Testament, for kings and popes, and is quite concerned about these authorities he doesn't see backed up by Scripture. And so instead, he's suggesting each person is directly responsible to God. In other words, it's not just the Pope and the King working as agents of God, to whom we're all then subordinate. Rather, all of us are equals and equally responsible to God. Wycliffe doesn't carry these ideas to their extreme. Some of his later followers will, but you could see how these would be quite explosive ideas in the context of the late Middle Ages. So let's unpack some of the implications, though, a little bit. So Wycliffe claims that the true church is not, then, the Pope and the visible hierarchy of the church, the priests and bishops and so on. Instead, he says, the true church is invisible. It's all of those who are predestined for salvation. So going back to St. Augustine here. And we can tell who's predestined based on the fruits of their lives. And so, he says, a lot of the leaders of the church, including many popes, the fruit of their lives was so negative, was so awful, that clearly, he said, they were not saved. They were not predestined. So the true church, again, is among those people who are the faithful. And people like the Pope might actually be outside of the true church. Again, a very shocking claim for the Middle Ages. And his rationale for this, in part, is that it's the Bible that is the sole source of church doctrine and practice. And so clergy can only have the authority explicitly given to them in Scripture. So when the Pope is out there claiming that he has total authority, he has total dominion, he can't find that in the Bible. And if it's not in the Bible for Wycliffe, that's not a power that the Pope can himself claim. He's going to challenge the papacy, the Pope, in other ways. He argues, for instance, that the Bible should be in the hands of all believers, translated into their own languages. And so Wycliffe begins the project of translating the Bible from the Vulgate, which is the Latin, into English. The 1300s is the time when English is replacing French as the language of the courts in England. And his intention was that these Bibles would be able to be understood by even people of lower social class. So the readings of Scripture shouldn't be limited just to the few, the elite, who could read Latin, but rather should be available to all people in England. Again, a very radical view for the time. He also attacks the doctrine of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation being the idea that had developed in the Roman Catholic Church that the bread and the wine, when they were consecrated, ceased to truly be bread and wine and were, in fact, the body and blood of Christ. You may not see that, but truly it has changed and is no longer what it was before. Wycliffe, though, argues for a different view. He says that Christ is present in a sacramental or a mysterious way, even as the bread remains truly bread and the wine remains truly wine. So somewhat similar to Luther's later notion of consubstantiation, if you're familiar with that. So it's not merely a symbol, but it does still remain bread and wine, even though in some way Christ is present in the elements. And the analogy there, he would argue, is that as in the incarnation, the presence of God in the Eucharist does not destroy the human or the earthly element. So for all of these reasons, as you would expect, Wycliffe ends up being declared a heretic by the Pope, as well as many figures in England. But he's able to avoid extended imprisonment. He actually dies a natural death. And after his death, his work and ideas are carried on by a group known as the Poor Preachers, or by their detractors called the Lollards, reviewed as not very smart, sort of lol, 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 the way they would talk. And these Lollards were influential in going around preaching around England, spreading copies of the Bible in English, emphasizing the Bible as the sole standard for faith and practice. And these ideas stay very popular, especially among the lower classes. So at the time of the English Reformation, there's already a large group of people in England who have taken up these Reformation-sounding ideas. Wycliffe's ideas also spread outside of England, most notably to the Czech reformer Jan Hus, or John Huss, who ends up being burned at the stake for a number of ideas that are quite similar to Wycliffe's. So all in all, Wycliffe is an interesting character. I'll read you some of Mormon's summary description of Wycliffe. Mormon writes, "In himself, he is to us an unattractive character, for we know him almost solely from his own writings, which are full of bitterness and contempt, and from the attacks of his enemies. Yet behind all this, there must have been a flame of real concern for the welfare of God's people. So much a scholar and so little a saint, Wycliffe was yet able to arouse men to such passionate zeal for righteousness that they willingly gave their bodies to be burnt for the faith that was in them. With all his faults, Wycliffe succeeded in lighting a candle which burnt steadily through many years of trial, and which is by no means extinguished at the present day." All right, so for our Zoom discussion, a couple things to think about. Number one, to what extent should we speak of Wycliffe as the morning star of the Reformation, the title he's traditionally given? Should we view him as sort of this early figure of the Reformation, or is he better understood as a late medieval figure? And then second, some of the ideas that Wycliffe expressed, how well do these ideas line up with what Anglicans currently believe on different issues? So these might be some interesting things for us to discuss, and I'll look forward to that next week.